Rachel?
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, sir. Sir.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. Yes.
So,
shall we start with the proceedings?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. We are very happy to welcome you to today's webinar by Dr. Sreerekha Sathi, Revaluing India's Welfare Workers. Before we start the proceedings, may I request the participants to please keep your microphones on mute. After the presentation, we will have a question and answer session. You can please type in your comments or queries to the speaker in the chat box. We will read them out for you. This will help the speaker address more queries and comments. So without much further ado, I request Professor Michael Claridon to please take over the proceedings. So you're on mute.
Good afternoon, everyone. I have great pleasure and satisfaction in welcoming Sreerekha Sathi. I hope I pronounced your name correctly. Yeah, of course, I understand that she is now on the faculty of the Institute of Social Studies in Hague, an institution with which I've got a very long personal association. And in fact, it goes to the early 1990, or even the end of 1980s, when Louis Emery was a legend in his own lifetime. Louis Emery was the director of the institute, and he was a great friend of Professor K.N. Raj, who was my mentor, academic mentor. There are a lot of stories of their own joint experiences in different parts of the world to tell, including being caught in the great uprising in Sri Lanka in the 1980s, early 80s. Of course, Louis Emery's work in the International Labour Organization is well known. He was the founder director of the World Employment Program and all that. And I've had more occasions to work closely with your institute, including when the CDS undertook an international training program for the United Nations Fund for Population Activities. And part of the program was centered in the ISS, and part of it was centered in the CDS in Trivandrum. So those kinds of things, if I keep on telling, like every old person, I have the tendency to keep on telling such stories, and I'll be boring all of you. But I find among your special interests very many interesting points, and particularly I find that you are also interested in Kerala model, which I thought was a surprising inclusion. Of course, I've had my own small contribution to that concept, and now there is you might have come across that book already, but nevertheless, I thought I'll call your attention to not a very recent book, but a new book in 2015 by Prerna Singh, how solidarity works for welfare, subnationalism, and social development in India. It's state-wise case studies, and one of the case studies and the leading case study is that of Kerala, where she puts forward a very interesting counter uh, thesis that subnationalism is the factor which prompted Kerala to, I mean, different from what what was for a while known as the CDS explanation. In that way, it is quite a, and of course that includes some of the questions that we are going to discuss today. I mean, about the role of welfare workers, uh, and how do you value it, socially value it, and not in terms of. And this becomes much more of a matter of discussion, particularly in the context of this efforts by the present government as well as its immediate predecessor, uh, since they have undertaken this project of rebuilding Kerala. Now, rebuilding Kerala would depend upon quite a bit of voluntary contribution by the welfare workers. And how do you account for it in the total scheme? And there is still a contention that there are two uh, contending kind of proposition. One, of course, is you know rebuilt Kerala development program called RKDP, which is more or less which is supposed to be a summary of how to implement the UNDP device uh, scheme of Rebuild Kerala. But Rebuild Kerala initiative seems to have been sidelined to some extent by this new and to some of us apparently slightly bureaucratic approach of depending upon consultancies and that kind of operations in this RKDP. While some of the organizations who were very seriously involved in this kind of discussions right from the very beginning, thought that the earlier program was more not only democratic, more participatory and 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 of course, this since there is a difference of opinion on that score, it becomes much more interesting to listen to your presentation, which will be focusing upon evaluating or re-evaluating the contribution of the welfare workers. Then there is this recent shift, which is also very well known, that the government of present government or the left democratic uh, coalition which supports them, they shifted away from slightly from welfareism to care. Care has not been strictly analytically defined, but we all know what is meant by care. And care work, is it different from welfare work or an extension of welfare activities itself? These are also issues which I think could be discussed extensively in this context. Um, we are happy that you are with us and you are going to discuss these issues with us. Um, we hope that your relationship with the Kerala Council of Historical Research will continue and that we will have the benefit of your training and your understanding on other occasions too. Welcome once again.
Thank you. Will I start?
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Professor, again for this very kind introduction and also sharing with me some of the memories about ISS. I'm new to ISS. I joined last year, and with COVID, I haven't had much of an opportunity to get to know a lot of people, and I get to know the institution in 1 year, but it's in the process. So I do hear some stories about the history of IS's connection with Kerala too from some of the senior members here, briefly though. So thank you to you, and thank you also, Rachel, for to making part of this. And Rachel is an old friend from a Delhi Times, so this is a community of friends. So I'm very happy and thankful to KCHR for inviting me to be part of this. Um, I also want to say, pay my respects to, to talk to this lecture, to dedicate this to Dr. Sharda Mani, who recently passed away. I remember her contributions, and she's been an inspiration for a woman like me, in my younger days, her in 20s in Kerala, and also briefly in Delhi sometimes. So I want to remember her in this moment. Um, we thought of choosing this month of May to talk about this on as being thinking about as a labor issue, though I kind of had to push it to later part of May. But I'm happy that this conversation is happening in this moment, which is because it's a very important moment in for not only India but for other parts of the world to think about labor in a new and in the light of a pandemic, which brings a lot of important issues for us to challenges we are facing now. Um, as we know, as we remember Labor Day, the history of it, where we talked about maybe 8 hours workday, sometime in the 19th century. But then when we look back at it now, remember the month of May and the struggle for labor rights. It's important for us to remember that we have not really, succeeded much. In fact, maybe we are a bit moving backwards, thinking about, for example, the new labor codes in India, which is allowing asking workers to be available for 6 a.m. to 7 p.m., like more than 13 hours a day. And so there is a lot of setback when we think specifically about workers' rights. And in the context of welfare workers is definitely it's an important section, thinking about not just the fact of thinking the importance of having a welfare state, but then who actually are welfare workers, who does implement these very important schemes, which are sometimes responsible for survival of millions of people in our country, and also a welfare state, the meaning of it in other parts of the world. So I'm trying to today talk a little bit about, and not going into much of the history of welfare schemes, but I want to mainly focus on three aspects of around it. One, to think about the role of welfare workers in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. Secondly, touch upon the role of privatization and the issue around that, and how to look at it again in the contemporary times, and then to be able to maybe touch upon some of the challenges we would be facing in the future times, and how to maybe rethink about the role of welfare workers within India. So I'm not focusing on only on Kerala, and I'm just trying to briefly talk upon based on some of the recent research in the COVID-19 times and the contribution of welfare workers. Now, the Indian labor market, as you know, has been informalizing its workforce and which we have more than 90% of our workers, as you know, part of the informal economy, and in which a huge number is also contract workers. And most of these workers not only have a a living wage, not even have a minimum wage in the way we understand it. And then the coming up, the pandemic has brought up, of course, as you can imagine, major issues, and which has taken up from the already existing challenges and issues we have been facing through privatization, contract workers and the rights, and then what's happening to communities on larger impacts of issues of those around privatization. Now, the welfare state, I again not want to go into a detailed discussion about that, but I want to stick to the workers in this context. The welfare workers, in this context, those who are not maybe familiar with the what it means, I'm here talking about women workers with specific welfare schemes, mostly connected to the addressing issues in the communities of, on reproduction, health care, education, etc. So we have India as a country which has a long history of welfare schemes, which has been also expanding with more and more workforce joining the welfare workers, welfare, many different fields of welfare schemes. With the coming of the COVID-19 pandemic, now the story of these workers have changed completely. Now, as you know, on the one part, we can think about a bit around broadening the definition and what happened to the issue of care work and the meaning of it and how it changed. And suddenly there is a new realization of that, or an urgency, or a or someone is forcing us to rethink about what is the meaning of care work in the context of a pandemic. And on the other hand, we will connect this to the other existing structural and large issues, which has been also been important in behind the story. In globally, I think there's been a debate. Many theorists have already in the past year have written about how COVID-19 forced the world to think about in a new way about care work, and connecting it to something being an essential work and life-giving work more than becoming more important than profit making, and how many countries are now forced to communities and countries and governments are suddenly facing with this challenge of how to address this and then how to go beyond this. When I say welfare work, as Professor Theragan mentioned, care work and connect the relationship with welfare workers. In this context, of course, most of the welfare work, welfare schemes implemented by the state are in some of the fields are directly connected to care work and some indirectly connected to care work, and broadly most of it coming within what we call social reproduction or health issues or education, or in multiple forms and definitions of care work. So here I'm going to briefly look at, just those who are not familiar with the issue again, to talk about what Indian welfare workers, where they're located and what's the history of it and how some of the core issues have been within that. Then I would like to also move to talk a little bit about the new theoretical and conceptual debates in the context of COVID-19 and how to see a change in the need to look at these issues. In the context of welfare work in India, it's been the workforce within that has been one of the fastest growing groups of working women in our country. So if we put some of the major schemes together itself, for example, ASHA workers or Anganwadis and midday meal workers or SSAs, some of these together will come to between 5 million to even, if we include the state welfare schemes. Along with that, and this would all go to 5 million to 10 million or more if we look at the number of workers involved in this. So definitely this has been one of the fastest growing sectors for working women in the country. And along with that, they provide very essential basic services to mainly also to the marginalized sections of the country. So definitely a very important sector of work. But my conversation is also, it's an important thing that I'm not really talking about welfare schemes in terms of who are the beneficiaries and how those schemes have impacted. No, I'm actually talking about who are implementing those schemes. So who are the people who are going there, out there in the field, and making sure that these schemes which are implemented by or the government, and then how to who actually connect them to people and making it real. So these women workers then of course have a long history of making actually India into a meaningful democracy, and their contribution, whether it has been recognized or valued, is an important issue that to look into. Even if we look at three broad, bigger schemes in terms of Anganwadis or Asha workers or midday meal, we see that in the context of COVID-19 pandemic, um, their role and the demand from them in terms of workload or what is expected of them has dramatically changed. And they are also directly facing a new set of challenges, which has not been there in the past in the way they worked in their everyday life. So this is adding to the already existing issues which they have been facing. So on the one hand, the sectors of women welfare workers, it's already heavily gendered. As you know, we, unlike in some other countries, we have these schemes are only we employ only women workers, and also there are certain characteristics about them, and that's also been a bit changing. For example, earlier in the 70s, when ICDA started employing taking women into as honorary workers. They were single women. They preferred sometimes, whether multiple status of them, widowed or divorced, and we had single women, many of them in the rural areas, working in these Anganwadis. And then later, their interest changed, and government started actually, in fact, directly suggesting that we would prefer to have married women, considering their experience in addressing issues of families and reproduction, etc. Interestingly, they all had very feminized kind of also names, such as Sathins and Yashodas, very, you can see how that has been also a very interesting way of feminizing those fields of work. Why I got interested in looking at the question of welfare workers in my when I was living in Delhi. So I had come back from studying after my master's, and in almost a decade in Delhi. Before I got into full-time academia, I was into part-time doing different kinds of work in Delhi. So almost a decade, I was more part of many working groups, which looks into workers' rights and women's rights in multiple platforms. And one of the issues which I remember, also an event which influenced me, inspired me to look into the question of welfare workers was, I think it was in 2006, there was a massive rally of women workers in these schemes in also a hunger strike, and very well organized by the India Federation of Workers and Anganwadi Workers and Helpers. And multiple locations have seen these massive protests, mainly bringing up their issues of talking about, say, the right to minimum wage and regularization of their work, um, moving from, forever temporary nature to thinking about recognition as workers and valuing their contribution to Indian democracy. So these protests have also been inspiring. Also, it showed that how they were very well organized and the unions were very powerful. Millions of, between multiple unions, you have the Communist Party and unions. BJP also have a union, and then they claim to have more members, and the way but the membership works and how the quality of how they engage with the workers in the community are also very different. But the fact that unions have been very active also shows that how they have been successful in organizing, demanding better wages in different parts of India, demanding better recognition of their work and for fair wages. This has come a long way. But at the same time, there also has been setbacks. In fact, to some extent, serious setbacks, especially in the question of raising issues of regularization of their jobs, and the new set of challenges which has been coming now, which directly can take up how their work, to what extent their work is valued, and what kind of rights they have as workers. In the past 1 year, especially after COVID, since the pandemic started, doing any research, especially social science research, has been challenging. And in fact, many scholars are writing about those challenges, methodological challenges in terms of being in the field, collecting stories from people. How do you actually do research in times of COVID? In fact, in my own institute, people are doing some interesting work looking at that. In one of the recent writings, Professor Bina Agarwal also is raising the issue of the challenges of doing research during COVID times, how people are mostly doing their collecting stories through telephonic conversations or finding other ways of reaching out to people because of the challenges in being in the field. And along with that, what have been the focus of the research in the COVID time? So two things which has come up, of course, which I'm sure many of you are already familiar with, the fact that the pandemic globally has forced people to look at the gendered impact of it, and mainly sort of again focusing within that into one, issues of mainly care work, and two, also addressing issues of violence against domestic violence, as has come up as an important issue. At the same time, many scholars have also pointed out that the COVID-19 pandemic has forced us to redefine the nature of precarious very forms of care work and life-making work. And in fact, how new debates and theories are looking into relationship between care work, reproductive work, devalued paid work, or voluntary work, or is it forced work? So this has, the COVID-19 pandemic has created a new situation in which we are actually forced to rethink about these questions and the importance of it. Well, now I can think of few works, like for example, Bhattacharya is in the context of COVID-19 pandemic, is talking about how care and life-making work or care work has now, it has to be seen as essential work of society. Some scholars, like my colleague Sigman, has also called it essential work, as saying that the redefined role of an essential worker has also changed from being profit making to life making in the context of COVID-19 pandemic. These scholars have also shown there's many experiences and that how their experiences vary within the multiple locations of so-called essential work, and how they are now providing they are seen as providing care to community in different realms of work, care work, which can be including some health workers to domestic workers to even or sex workers. What kind of contributions they do into making it life-making work. But in our context, if you want to come back to welfare workers and stay limit us within that, um, the broader question of what do we want to, what kind of community we want, and the pandemic has forced us to rethink about, do we just want to keep producing more and more, or we want to have some form of work which would be life-saving and life-making, and sort of prioritize that over massive capitalist never-ending forms of production. So this has bringing back the attention to issues of social reproduction and specific sectors of caring, nursing, teaching, cleaning, all these fields of work which are mostly dominated by women workers. And that includes a very fundamental part of it in the what is a meaningful way to the community is taken care of by welfare workers. So Nance, when in the beginning of the pandemic, when some of the feminist scholars like Nancy Fraser said that the pandemic is actually a perfect storm of capitalist irrationality. It reveals how the capitalist system has been, will be, unable to address and will the important issues of what faces humanity and how to see human beings and how resources will be looked at, and how it reveals that our health and our lives cannot be ruled by market forces alone. And thousands, in many ways, many scholars are now actually talking about this in the time of a crisis, and the importance of for us to democratize the way meaning of work and to be able to rethink about it. So this has been a situation where the market has, and it continues to be a challenge, that market versus care. And then within that, what would be the role of the state, and how do we address things which even money can't buy? And we suddenly realize the need for all over the world rethink about a welfare state. What does it mean? Why is the state not present in some circumstances? What was the state supposed to do? And between rich countries to poor countries, some countries fail to address issues of what is the role of the state in even rich countries. For example, extremely resourceful countries like the US were struggling to actually distribute even basic mask or basic needs during the time of the pandemic. But then Kerala was discussed a lot in another context, and how Kerala has been in a major way attempting to face the challenge and stand up to it. Between India and Brazil, there has been interesting comparisons and situations for reasons which that how it is important for the state to be present at the same time, to what kind of logical, rational, evidence-based research has to be, scientific research to be taken into consideration, and how the state would actively play a role in addressing the pandemic. So these questions have come up where it's been important to look at the other than the immediate needs of and the crisis and the challenges that COVID-19 has faced, also look at the long-term impact of it. And this is something which again Bina Agarwal talks about in her recent work, talk about how in India, within specific though the specific effects of the pandemic are immediate, some are much more complex and some are long-standing impact they would have in terms of, especially to addressing the existing gender inequalities in the country. So women are particularly at the risk in the long term of losing more and more livelihoods because of the pandemic, and they will also have fewer employment options, and there will be an issue of food scarcity, and there will be the need for more, more in multiple different regions of India, how that would lead to the impact of that would be reflecting in different ways in terms of gender inequalities and poverty, etc., which would lead to that. So I want to now talk a little bit about the history, as I said, the role of the state, and then looking at some of the features of what's happening within the welfare workers in India, connecting the history to the contemporary times. So as I said, where do we look for a state in the times of a crisis, which is the state is going to come into picture, is going to provide to us and take care of it. And then we also need to this community of people who will connect between the community and the state, which is going to provide us. And that's where we locate most of the welfare workers. So if the failure, or if the state failed to actively come forward and then be present in and provide for and take measures in which the community and the state is connected, and a crisis can be addressed. So the role of the welfare workers that way is in one way defined and shaped by what the state is providing, and them to continue in their role. And on the other hand, the community and the welfare workers work together, as we have seen in the recent past in India very clearly. When the state was not actively taking responsibility in many other parts of India, the community came forward and worked together with the welfare workers to make it possible that to address a crisis. The theorists have the recent theories, and especially looking at welfare states, have actually argued that India, for Anderson and Wood are also talking about how India has been moving from a liberalist welfare state to more of a corporatist form of welfare state. But for us, when we look at what is actually happening in the field, what is new is that in the past, we had welfare workers taking care of the marginalized sections in the community. And they were actually trying to be there, not because they are privileged or they have the resources, but they're part of the same community, and community members are actually asked and put in a role to take care of their own community. For example, in another way to put it, most of the welfare workers came from within the marginalized communities, or they were low middle class, and they were part of the community. The workers are selected in that way, and they were actually given the responsibility by the state to take care of the community. For example, to provide them with all these, the long list of things which development work or whatever we call it should be happening in the local community. The change only in the new context is that we are adding more and more responsibility to their work, which was already there. They were already, the burden of the workload of welfare workers in this context have always been beyond what they could actually do and for the wages they get. Now, in the new context, we are actually asking for more and more, to the extent that the entire responsibility, especially when there is a state which is failing to be actively responsible to address a crisis, the responsibility is falling upon these workers, and they are forced to work with the community to find ways to survive. I want to when we think about the history of the welfare workers in India, then in a national context, Indian development work and in mostly has been historically has been linked to women who work voluntarily in the communities. I'm sure you know whether we call it honorary or voluntary. There are multiple definitions of it, and in fact, we have reached a point in which, if we look at the ASHA workers, we even ASHA worker is defined as an activist. Okay, so we moved away from even considering them as honorary workers or voluntary workers. Now we are saying here comes a woman who's an activist. And so she doesn't even have to be paid an honorarium. Now she's actually paid an incentive based on what she will do on an everyday basis. So many of our scholars within India, whether say Agnihotri or Majumdar or others, have already written about these issues, of which is um, from looking at from 5-year plans to CSWI report to multiple ways in which what has been happening to these welfare workers historically, and what has been the demand, looking at, say, talking about wages, whether it's workers who were not even paid at all. For example, the midday meal workers were not even paid till they were not even paid anything till like 2009 or something. All the sevikas and the ashuras and all these women who should be available there for the community, and most of it is their own interest and passion and commitment to take care of the community which they belong to. So what we see now is a change in that. More and more young workers are joining, the schemes are expanding, and at the same time, the demand as what is expected from them is definitely going up in terms of what they will be doing. So one issue, of course, as I mentioned, has been, which the welfare workers has been raising, is broadly what we call schematization, which means within they remain schemes forever, for decades, and also the workers remain temporary forever. One landmark step which the workers tried to do, especially within the Anganwadi workers, was they filed a lawsuit for regularization in 2006 when they went to the Supreme Court. But and it was a major setback at that time for the unions and for the struggles, because when the regularization was, Supreme Court rejected it and actually said that the Anganwadi workers the post cannot be considered civil post. In fact, they said that these workers they don't hold a civil post, a statutory post, and they don't carry any function of the state. So that was a very, really shocking judgment, in fact, which made, the workers and the unions and people who work on the issue and scholars to rethink about newer strategies of actually how to address issues of better wages and regularization of welfare workers. In the COVID-19 context, it has had a major impact on the life goals of these women workers, and they're struggling. On the one hand, they themselves are struggling there, and then they are trying to support the communities which are struggling to survive. And while in the past 1 year, so many of these workers in different parts of India have also experienced violence, incidences of violence against them. So while they're struggling with long delays in their wages for a wage which is much less for the value of the work they do, along with that, in the COVID times, many of these workers also had to experience direct violence from the other members of the community. And I'm sure you have read such reports about in such incidents in different parts of India, especially in the north. And I did try to collect some of those stories again through telephones and conversations and all, and those were written, reported stories from different parts of Delhi and UP and other parts, where these during the lockdown, where these workers had to, especially for example ASHA workers or ANMs, who had to provide counseling, create awareness in the community. They go door to door, do surveys, and look at which are the containment zones and when they become hotspots. And they had to take the risks, to going to people, visiting them, giving them help. At the same time, they take the risk of getting infected, and then they themselves, like in the case of experience of nurses in in India and other parts of the world, they were boycotted, and sometimes local people attacked them in certain situations, and they were also accused of spreading the virus. So not it's not surprising that many of these workers also became victims of COVID-19 and lost their lives. And this has been looked into, for example, institutions like organizations like Amnesty International published a report looking into this. Some of the stories talked about how the daughter of a health worker was hit on her head with an iron rod, um, and saying that she and her family are actually, by living there in the community, they were responsible for spreading the virus. Some family members were beaten up, some children were not, their children were not allowed to go to school, and they themselves were not allowed to work. And there have been incidences like that in Haryana, UP, and Delhi, in many parts of India. Um, so they were trying to work and function in the midst of this crisis. At the same time, they're not only that they would take along with all the burdens they were handling, these were actually direct attacks on some of these workers. And I'm not familiar if such incidents has happened in Kerala, but it did happen in many other parts of India. This is a phase which I'm talking about right now. It's a new phase. I'll come to that later. This is in the beginning, in the early months in last year. Um, the the stories from ANMs, like for example, the ANMs and ASHAs are sort of ANMs work at the background of it, and their roles in many ways are connected, and the contributions are the same in terms of public health, and how their role changed, historically, and the impact of privatization into it, or how the role of a midwife is, and the multi-purpose of work they do as public health workers. This is something again which I'll just come back to when I talk about privatization. But here in this context, the ANMs and the ASHAs or Anganwadis, all the people who had their wages, increasing in their wages, and demand for it has been consistent, and has had multiple responses from different states. And also it's important to see the role unions played in terms of how the unions were powerful and to some extent successful in demanding better wages together in different parts of India. Now, this actually, the COVID-19 situation opens up new challenges for the workers, along with situations in which these unions will still have to find ways, in when the crisis is over, to come back and think ways in which, where the basic, for example, an incentive for ASHA workers in many places are still, like, say, between 2,000 to 7,000. So which is, that's what they get in terms of the work they do. So think about the crisis and the response, and the responsibilities they have to take, and the challenges they have to face in the contemporary times. I want to talk a little bit about the question of privatization, um, and liberalization, and what has been happening to the question of welfare. I don't have much time to go into the details of it, but this is something which I have done in my earlier work, but I'm not going to take a lot from it, but just say a few things here. While the workers have been organizing and demanding regularization of their work and better wages, the unions also have strongly fought against the privatization and especially in the NGOization too in the context of social welfare schemes, and how that has been coming up forcefully in the context of a globalized neoliberal political economy. So this is a phase which of course started in the 1990s with structural adjustment policies, and also when the Congress was in power with liberalization and provisions of social welfare. But it entered a new phase with an acceleration of neoliberal policies under the BJP government. Now, there are new welfare schemes which has come into picture, many of them, but not really mostly connected to, say, field of care, as we call it. And it's also important to remember that the workers who implement these schemes, how they are connected, the schemes are connected to the community, still remain the same sector of workers. So the BJP government had brought in some schemes like, say, toilet building, pension schemes, and some of the schemes about family planning and financial assistance to pregnant women. And Modi had appealed his sisters to join accident insurance schemes, and also a very popular one was the free gas connection to 50 million or some other women. And there's been an interesting study by Chachi, Amrita Chachi, who was a colleague of mine, looking at what this meant and how to understand this in the context of contemporary India, and how whether it departs or actually reinforce the neoliberalism. And for her, she says that this is based on, she look at if this increases, like actually further the process of decommodification, you know, vis-a-vis being a universal citizenship, or and also at the same time, these schemes make it whether they promote a sort of stratified market-based entitlement. So moving, this moves pushes people more towards market dependency or not. And so she has argued that she sees a shift in the policies from welfare in India to more towards financialization and also market fostering individual entrepreneurism. And in the recent times, she also argued, along with others like Purudale, that the neoliberalism and Hindutva, how they, though they are contradictory in some ways, at the same time they join hand in hand, imagining a global Hindutva presence, and same time reinforcing patriarchal gender relations and in regard to welfare, whether from moving from the old policies to the new policies. Now, there are multiple ways in which we can look at it through, the inclusion, we can look what has been happening with the Aadhaar, bank accounts linking, how that has an impact on, so-called whether it actually connects to the community, and what are the ways in which we see women's entrepreneurship in the new. There's been multiple writings about critiques of microcredit programs, which was supposed to stand for women's entrepreneurship, and how they actually increase the potential indebtedness. And these are questions which have, forcing everyone to enter into banking, even though they are poor in the community and struggling with debt traps. So this has been the out of the home entrepreneur links, which is the ideology of neoliberalism in the present time. So she actually see it as this as been an important way we are moving forward. However, as I said, when we think about the workers in the community, it's the same community of workers who are mostly addressing issues of care and working within the community. And now this is also, we can connect in briefly to the what has been happening and the studies and the research done on Kudumbashree in the context of Kerala. Recently, Devika and Benita were also looking at, what has been the challenges which Kudumbashree as a state welfare scheme has been facing. in a major successful state welfare program, which brought in a lot many women together, organized them really well, and had a very interesting role to play in the so-called development, local development roles. At the same time, how they had that program are also challenging, faces many challenges in terms of how overburdening women with certain types of work, and how women have been asked to be responsible to take up most important roles in the community, especially in the context of COVID. I think you see that the on the one hand we see the local democratic programs and whether how the contradiction between development and larger neoliberal policies, if that is being reflected in stories like in Kerala, the critique of self-help groups and how that is also and connecting that to the experiences of Kudumbashree, leading to many exploitative situations of these women, and how they themselves are again engaging in very neoliberal individual entrepreneurships. So how the emerging of the organizing and the scheme like Kudumbashree, and how in terms of larger structural changes where they are in terms of it. So this is what has come out of the studies which I mentioned. So that's also a space for us to rethink about it, whether we are actually working, are we in terms of an interesting space in terms of local development and democratizing local community, or are we in other than the locally what is happening in the broader level, are we kind of working hand in hand with the new neoliberal steps in towards development. So I would now move to the last part of my presentation, where I just want to quickly talk about how the work on the studies done on India on increasing privatization and corporatization of the healthcare in the country, and how those in the contemporary times that has led to, and what is happening to in the current situation, how to look at them. So public in the field of public health, whether Kadir and others talked in the recent times about the challenges, for example, within public health sector. But the important point to remember about the history of this resistance within welfare workers is that the unions have been to a major extent successful in resisting, for example, NGOization, or for example, the experiment of health hubs where a coalition of NGOs come together. So it was not just about how these welfare schemes were financially supported by earlier big institutions, either World Bank or UN institutions, or multiple organizations coming together. But here we were actually addressing a situation where at the local level, what food they will eat, or who will be employed as workers, who will give the training, and who will do the appointments. So, and Anganwadis themselves, or centers, or these were going to be privatized and run by corporations. So that's something which has been strongly resisted. And so these are, I think, interesting stories to look into, the story of health hubs and how those attempts to massively privatize welfare schemes has been resisted by within India. Even the field of midwifery, the corporatization of midwifery, which has been studied by scholars like Scholin, talks about how a transition which has happened, the traditional understanding of midwifery, and how the changed nature of it because of the training and by transnational corporations coming into picture, and the very definition of who is a midwife is now defined by these corporations in many parts of the world, and strongly again, and that's the ICM, which is in midwifery international institution, which is based in the Netherlands, where I work now. So these are issues which have been taken up and addressed, but at the same time adding to the new situation, bringing in new questions to us, that where do we go from here. um, Another important issue, which the last point, the last 2 points for me, is that to look at again how caste and religion has been playing an important role in the definition and understanding of care work. Now, this is something I have again addressed this in my book, my work earlier, but and others have worked on this too. But for us to see that the logic, the present government and the conversation around Hindutva has actually pushed forward these agendas, and that would be coming out more openly, and we will be struggling with it, especially in times of a pandemic, where whether the communities, the religion-based approach to supporting communities, or the which is growing on the already existing caste-based divisions, which was already there in the Indian context. So when I studied, I have looked into, for example, seen what we have, for example, Harijan Anganwadis or Bhangi colonies, where Anganwadi. So these are questions where the government themselves looks at who is in that area and who will be they're comfortable with as a worker. So then based on that, a caste-based selection of workers and helpers are happening in the field, which is actually against the very idea of how we should be as a state should be working against caste discrimination. But then how that has been compromised. It has been very interesting to see how that was developing and the challenges which came around that, addressing issues of caste. Now it's also expanding to religion-based, for example, Muslim communities, and how the welfare work where it would reach and what kind of challenges it would bring in. And so this is a larger issue where, again, when we talk about appointment of workers, training given to them, and what kind of support they will get from the state, and it get expanded to larger issues of how the community itself is defined and how actually the state is directly contributing or indirectly supporting caste-based, community-based divisions within how welfare work would reach to the community. On a larger level, I can say, I would conclude here by saying that the pandemic had actually revealed many of the flaws and actually which already existed in our welfare system, and actually exposed us to larger questions which will be facing us now in the future. On the one hand, is actually teaching us that the value, how to look at the value of the contribution of these women welfare workers, and revalue and reassess what their contributions are, and are they doing much more than what we actually in a way indirectly force them to do in the name of voluntary or honorary work. And in a globalized corporatized India, where do we stand in terms of how do we understand healthcare or subsistence work, and for the poor, is it only about how the new situation bring in certain questions that all of this would fall upon some women workers in multiple parts of India who will have the responsibility to finally reach out to the most suffering poor communities in our country. So the burden of, is it this going to fall on these workers? So from my experience of what I have heard in the recent times in parts of North India, it's very the stories are really horrific, and in the sense that we are not really even able to understand what exactly is going on now with the on the one hand, the regular activities, the impact of that is that the regular activities the health workers or welfare workers did has been stopped. So people who are suffering with chronic illnesses, they have to take, that is being taken a backseat. In a state like Meghalaya, we have heard about hundreds of newborns or pregnant mothers have died in within few months of last year because of their inability to have access to where these welfare workers would reach out to them, because the welfare workers are now diverted to addressing mainly the crisis which came through the pandemic. So even, and this is a global experience too, to some extent, what has happened to migrant workers. Even in Netherlands, I've been part of a study looking into how migrant workers have experienced during COVID times, lack of support, even in unwanted pregnancies, issues of domestic violence, kind of difficulties they have in understanding the language if they are not. So these are specific to migrant experiences, which I am sure already work has been done. But welfare workers are the support system for most of the migrant workers too. So that is one big area, again, where the welfare workers are core to their survival in many other ways. So the new phase is something which I'm not even able to address, like in the sense that the new phase of COVID, which has happened in India in the recent times, definitely totally devastating. I'm sure we don't know much about the stories till now. I mean, even people in Kerala have talked about how in comparison the access to resources and support system they have, we don't have we are not forced to throw our dead bodies into a river and they are not floating in our rivers. So we are in a different place. At the same time, um, we don't know a lot of the stories yet. In the new phase of COVID pandemic in India, it's not a time to do research now, because we are still struggling with the crisis and we are not able to understand the magnitude of what is happening. And many of us have lost our own friends or families and have not been able to bear with the cope with the even address our own trauma related to it. So this is a new phase, and what is happening and the experience of welfare workers in this context, where are they? So in the beginning of the COVID and earlier, we have seen a lot of reports talking about ASHA workers or other workers who are actually trying hard to survive and contribute. Now we don't even hear about those stories anymore, not because they're not there, but because I imagine the situation is much more worse, and we are probably coming in the near future. More stories will come up, and we will have to prepare ourselves to address new challenges within our communities and within the country, where it has to go a long way in terms of restructuring and rebuilding the communities. So I would end by saying that on the one hand, these welfare workers shouldn't be forced to take care of their own communities out of desperation, while they themselves are not able to take care of their own families or themselves as women. On the other hand, we have to address that there is a state. The state should recognize, in every state within India and also nationally, we should be able to stop overburdening these women workers and bring up a situation that we can recognize the value of their work and reward them in a fair and just in a decent manner. I would stop there. I'm sorry if I took too long. I was trying to bring many things at the same time. Thank you so much for the time.
Thank you very much, Professor Sathi. I would request Rachel to take over and conduct the question answer session. Then at the end, we can come back to a kind of a general discussion, but as much as the time allows. First of all, let me congratulate and thank Professor Sathi for presenting a very, very able presentation, which really conveyed some new insights into the problem. And now I hope there would be interesting discussion on this. So, Dr. Rachel.
Thank you, sir. Like I announced in the beginning, I request the participants to please type in your queries and comments into the chat box. We'll read them out for the speaker. And once the queries in the chat box are over, we can go into discussion. In fact, by the time the questions come, I already had a couple of queries which I had typed out. So I will read those out for you. So my first query is, you mentioned the initial part of your talk about how social scientists are reflexively looking at doing social sciences in these times and the methodological challenges involved in that. So could you reflect on it a bit more in the context of your research? Like your early work on Anganwadi workers, State Without Honor, as I understand, had a major fieldwork component. I'm especially interested to see how you would compare what you're doing as a researcher now with that situation. Second is an unrelated query, so I'll go to that after.
Okay, so shall I respond now? Yeah. Okay. Yeah, this is it's definitely forcing us to rethink about. I mean, first of all, already we have many in feminist epistemology or methodology, and also from the school of decolonizing social sciences, decolonizing academia. We have been addressing many multiple ways in which we could actually rethink about how we do research and what does it mean to be collecting stories from the field, and how do we actually bring in connect quantitative and qualitative research together, and what has been the hierarchies and power hierarchies and issues, especially within academia, not just students going into the field, but also power hierarchies between other members of global north and global south, and also between students and teachers, and between students and the community, researchers and the community. So there are multiple levels of it. And addressing the questions we were raising, and especially within feminist methodology, has been thinking about positionality, give more importance to positionality, more important to reflexivity, and these are not just in terms of some meaningless words which came through some language of postmodern literature, but we especially scholars working in decolonizing the academia wanted to look at it in a meaningful way. And there has been conversations about giving importance to transformative methodologies and actually challenging people who are in academia to answer some very difficult questions and talk about how they present themselves, connect themselves to in the field, to community, and what are they actually giving. It's not about giving back, but is it about working together? And such contributions have also come from indigenous, mainly from a lot from indigenous research methodology, which has been developed by many feminist indigenous scholars. Now, in the COVID times, of course, the inability to be there. See, we are not able to travel, so we are not actually in the field, but there is always research being pushed within neoliberal academia to keep a time frame. You need to finish your research in time. And there's no compromise on that, even there is a pandemic out there. And everyone is pressured to do their work within the time limit. So that's the nature of the neoliberal academia. So now if we want to ask, you want to get a degree, a student want to get a degree in time, they have to go to the field, how will they do their research? A PhD student don't want to postpone their work. Teachers who get a grant don't want to postpone their work. A pandemic is going on and you still want to think about your research. There is an ethical problem there. What actually do you want to do? So in some ways, to address in terms of, okay, we do understand, then many people are working on what is happening with the pandemic in COVID in different parts of the world. So addressing that and connecting that to your own research, at the same time talking about what are the ethical possible ways in which you can actually still do research. So of course, not being in the field, but also doesn't mean that you can employ someone else who is available in your local community and then pay them or pay a community to get research done. As also, it's again problematic. So these are like, if not to appoint others to take responsibility and pay them to get a research done. At the same time, how can you have conversations, meaningful conversations, even using the technology, and then trying to understand and not to pressurize people for an outcome, at the same time to be within your limits of doing something in an ethical way. So these are starting points, and I think this is actually also connecting to the conversations on transformative methodologies earlier, and that's how we kind of some way try to cope with the present situation.
Thank you. The second query is, from your talk, you talked about the characterization of care work, how it depended a lot on traditional gender and maybe caste roles underlined through nomenclature such as Sevika. Have you, in course of your research, come across patterns of similar nature in welfare work in other parts of the globe, in the context of the pandemic or otherwise?
I would say, and I have seen similar situations in other parts of South Asia, but not globally. I think it's also important to remember that the meaning of welfare and welfare state is also very different in different parts of the world. So, and the genderedness is also definitely different that way. And I think we have more of a very strongly gendered welfare state system and schemes in place, and in comparison with other parts of the world, especially also considering the history of what actually welfare scheme or state would mean, and is very different in global parts of the global north and global south. And so we need to keep that in consideration. I think definitely we have trouble with a gendered, very strongly gendered, feminized and patriarchal way of understanding what care, and though it is, I mean, globally, of course, care work is, we know that this is there is a question of patriarchy there. But I think I'm specifically talking about, if we look at within schemes, welfare schemes, and what is actually happening, we are, definitely have a problem there, and how gendered and feminized it is.
Our next question is from Biju Matthew. Thanks for that interesting presentation. My query is this. We were talking from rooftop that the state is withdrawing from welfare measures. Now, truly, we are witness to that withdrawal. In that vacuum, community is filling in. The situation demands attention of two aspects. One, no one questions the role of the state. Second, how long the community and their effort can be relied on because people are getting tired.
I'm not sure if the state is actively present there, and the state is busy with bringing corporate sector and making the connections, and there are more and more schemes are introduced, and they are, as I said, revealed from the study of Chachi, that we see more and more financialization measures and entrepreneurship, and these are very an actively an active state which has a clear plan in its mind. So that is definitely there. What you are saying is that correct, in the sense that, yeah, we don't see a state which is actually there for the people, in the sense that when the pandemic hit, very few countries in the world would have had religious festivals or elections. The way we had addressed the pandemic, and they had led to major falling in our place, that we are facing a crisis. And that is, very few countries in the world have had similar experiences. So being a country with 2.4 billion people, and we have the absence of an active state to support in times of a crisis, and in specifically to be there to provide a system which where basic needs of the people are not met, and of course this has a long-term structural background to it. At the same time, the immediate needs of the state, the immediate presence of the state would have really helped many people to survive and to be alive, which the lives we have lost. And that, of course, has totally fell upon the community then to take care of it. And the community, as I said, people are forced to the community to get active, work with others and help themselves. They are left to fend themselves. And then that's where the welfare workers are working together with the community. And yes, we have a state, a completely failed situation in addressing this. And of course, within India, different states have different experiences. Experience of UP and experience of Kerala is not the same. I'm sure all of us have heard a lot of stories about people sharing those experiences where people have traveled within the country. But I think that it reinforces that what a welfare state can do, and by being present, it can save the lives of millions of people. And we have actually we are witnessing it in our everyday life now. Lack of oxygen, lack of should not be a reason for people to die, and lack of a hospital bed should not be a reason for millions of people to die. But that is actually what's happening. And then not even to talk about not being able to cremate the bodies of your people and to throw them in the river. It's a story. So yes, it's a very tragic state of affairs.
Thank you, Sreerekha. Professor Karagan, these are the typed in questions in the chat box. So while we wait for the rest of the queries, would you like to comment on the presentation?
Yeah, I would like to offer a comment which I'm not very sure whether it would fit in with the concerns of this presentation. If it is not, please forget it. See, I realized that in the late 19th century, the Scandinavian countries, particularly Norway and Sweden, found widespread problems of physical disorders, uh, stomach problems, skin diseases, etc., which was fairly widely recognized as the result of unhygienic practices. And the unhygienic practices having located as the way in which they clean uh, the plates on which they eat. The plates they dip, of course, with the weather conditions being very severely cold, they would dip it in a bucket of water and wait for the uh, the dirt that has accumulated to dry to uh, get rid of itself, and then put it put it out and wipe it and serve again. This they found is not really cleaning the plate. So they, in some experiments in some of the parishes, that is the church groups in villages, they found that if you have two more basins, one for ordinary water, one for hot water, and one for soap water, you would be able to get your plate clean and ready for, you know, for a clean food afterwards. And this was prescribed by some women's organizations as the practice. But then many people found it very difficult because it would have meant that their home budget would have gone up, because they have to heat up another basin full of water, and also another basin full of water with soap and all that. But nevertheless, the hygienic aspect that was hoped for made some of these women uh, to seek additional work to raise the money to to afford, so that they can afford to have these practices. And this seems to have worked, and now it has become a common practice all over Europe, and particularly in Scandinavian countries, to have all this kind of washing. Now, there's also been, the parish itself had its own organization, welfare organization, which was not so much the local government, but the community organization, which also spread the idea. I found a similar case in Kerala, and I have written about it in the Journal of Agrarian Studies in 2014, where Sri Narayana Guru, our prime premier social reformer, he advised mothers in the coastal villages, and particularly people who live very close to the sea and backwaters and rivers and all that, uh, to heat up the water before feeding their children, because heating up would kill off some of uh, the germs. That is the understanding. And being close to the water area, water um, sources, you tend to throw off all your junk into the water. That will be taken off during the low tide, but with the high tide, the same amount of dirt would come back. So he advised them that heating up the water would reduce sickness to their children, and also ultimately reduce the children's death rate, which was very high even in 1900s and 1910s. It is believed that is only by 1930 when the government of Travancore was able to put up a pediatric ward in the General Hospital in Trivandrum and start a pediatric center in um, um, Nagarkoil that could be reversed. But people though found that it meant heating up the water means increased home budget. Nevertheless, the women, possibly because of the fact that the advice came from such an august person as the Swami, partly because of their own effort, their own determination. They also did the. Now, these two groups played a very major role in the public health of both these regions, particularly in Kerala. It reduced the your death rate, the children's death rate, uh, as early as the 1920s. But they don't get classified as workers, because workers are the people who are employed, or were asked by some organization, whether it is the local government or the government, or the general public. But here, I think the persuasion came mainly from a community kind of a organization. How would you value this kind of a phenomenon? Um, this is what while you are talking, this occurred to me. I mean, I'm sorry if I'm taking you off from your main theme.
Well, thank you for the question. That's a very interesting story. I wasn't aware of it. So I think uh, the way I would see it is that there are many moments in history where communities have taken initiative to um, address a problem or contribute to a particular a form of development and participate in it. But when we, in the case of how I would see it as women workers, especially women in the welfare work, the way they are placed is that to what extent this is something voluntary or what we call honorary, something to actually critically think about. Especially in a country like India, where there is it's very strongly hierarchical in a society in terms of caste and religious divisions. Who are the women who do the actual work, and then beyond, not just their own, considering the fact that women take up work within their homes most of the time, most of the care work, even when they do paid work outside, and much of the division of labor within Indian homes have not changed even when women actually do paid work. And we have only found a solution using our existing caste and religious hierarchies by employing, if women are doing paid work, they can employ cheap labor by bringing women from lower class communities to replace their care work or reproductive work at home. But we haven't a way of addressing it as a changing in division of labor much in a meaningful way. But why I'm saying is that because the welfare workers are, as I said earlier, mostly coming from lower middle class or lower income class groups. And then there is a division between who is actually doing, whether somebody is a helper or a worker. And then there are many levels of it within that. But the kind of work they take up, and whether they are responsibly doing it, uh, that is really not the issue here. For me, the issue is that this is a work for a community's development. As you mentioned, this is an overall community benefit when we do something like that, not just or for an individual. Anything we do, whether in terms of customer water, health, education, child education, all of this is the need for the community, and we assist the development of the local community in from that perspective. But then why is it that those responsibilities are named voluntary or honorary, and then women who actually need resources, they are women who actually need the support of the state. So constantly it has been a strategy to actually connect a womanhood or the women's what, even from Marx to, everyone has called this the natural tendency of women to look at issues of care work and reproductive work and other the needs of the domestic space and also of the community. So we are actually expanding that, including environmental issues, the crisis which has come in the recent times. Everything is becoming more and more the responsibility of women workers. And then that is actually a troubling issue. I'm happy to see there are more and more, if there are new ways of addressing issues of local development comes up, and find innovative ways in which issues can be addressed, as the case in which you brought in as an example, and we could learn from that and we could bring that up. But it is not acceptable that the burden of those implementing those new ways of or methods of bringing in a progressive method here, step here, has to be falling on the responsibility again, into adding into the list of work which women have to do, whether household women or other women who are doing less paid, devalued work on behalf of the state and for the community. But I find the example you give really interesting. So I would like to actually go back and look at and read it. And so I have noted it down. So that's an interesting example, of course. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, thank you for your explanation, which I mean, it's quite acceptable. And there was also an element of technology transfer, because it is known that this this knowledge was there in the upper caste groups
Mm.
much earlier. But it is only through the preaching of Sri Narayana Guru that the caste which are considered to be lower could come to know of it and adapt it. That is
Okay.
another element involved. Thank you very much.
Um, so we don't have any more queries in the chat box. So if there are any further comments, short comments, or queries which you directly wish to address the speaker, please use the raise hand facility in the reaction. There's a raise hand icon. You can use that if you wish to ask the question directly to the speaker. Um, yeah, so we don't have any more queries. Was it correct? So we have come to an end of the question and answer session.
So, Rachel, you should be having somebody offering a formal thanks to Sreerekha.
Yeah. Uh,
Okay.
so on behalf of the KCHR, we are very happy to have had Dr. Sreerekha with us, talking on a very important issue. We have been thinking about different aspects of the pandemic, but this particular issue of uh, women and labor, which tends to get under addressed, especially in such a situation. Thank you, Sreerekha, for bringing that to light and into discussion. We are on behalf of KCHR, we would like to thank you very much for your time, and we hope that your association with the institution continues. I also like to thank all the participants for being part of this session. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much once again. Thanks to everyone who took time off from their busy activities to participate in this program. Hope to meet all of you at the next program too. Thank you.